Good evening, my name is Chris Morris and this is Breakdown for Flipping the Pyramid Radio. Just want to begin today by reminding people to visit the website of Flipping the Pyramid, which is flippingthepyramid.co.uk. We can download this program in the future, and there's many other interesting things that you can look at. And some of my previous programs, some of the programs by the other people that appear on the station are also available. I managed to set up a YouTube channel this week, despite the fact that Google have made it incredibly difficult to do so by forcing you to sign up for a Google Plus profile, and then not really explaining properly how you sign up for the normal YouTube ID, which results in the process being very arcane and complicated. No one wants a Google Plus profile. Well, I assume some people do, but I don't. But I've got one. I've got more than one actually, because I was already forced to have one to do something else previously. So, I've now got two Google Plus profiles. What I'm going to do with them, I've no idea. But every time I see my name appearing in the top right hand side of the screen, I sign out. I assume Google are tracking absolutely everything I do anyway. So what difference it makes, why they want me to sign up with a stupid profile, I have no idea. But anyway, I've managed to sign up for a YouTube channel. So if you type Breakdown Radio Show into YouTube, you should be able to find the channel, or if you try Breakdown and Flipping, as in Flipping the Pyramid, you should also be able to find it. And it's got my two previous programs, my two previous interviews with Keelan on that channel, and it'll have this program after this has been broadcast. I've also set up a lot of playlists on there, literally dozens, maybe as many as 100 different playlists that deal with a variety of subjects that are related to the system that I've been discussing over the last couple of weeks, and various subjects that I've either discussed or will be discussing as the weeks unfold. So I'd really recommend you take the time to have a look at those, because there's a lot of interesting material there. Some of which may be completely new to you, some of which may be familiar to you, but there's certainly a lot of you in there, and it's all stuff that is completely factual in basis. There's nothing contentious or controversial. Well, I suppose unfortunately sometimes the truth is controversial. Sometimes it does raise controversy, but there's nothing there that is not part of the factual record and that can be easily backed up. There's nothing there that is conspiratorial, you might say. So it's well worth having a look at that. Now, I just want to mention as well that I watched the Kaiser report on RT the day after last week's programme, and Kaiser report episode 370 actually discussed, in the second half, they discussed quite a lot of the issues that I was discussing, coincidentally. So it's well worth looking up that particular episode, just so that you can hear some reiteration and some further explanation of what I was discussing. Particularly relates to China buying gold and the position of the US dollar as the world reserve currency. So it's quite an interesting programme if you've got the time to watch that. It can be viewed on YouTube. After the last 2 weeks' programmes in which I broke down this corporate fascist credit capitalist system and how it's been crafted, and the kind of trading war that is currently taking place, the kind of tug of war for power and predominance, essentially, between what you could call as the Anglo-American establishment and the BRIC nations, particularly China. So we've reached the point now where you should hopefully comprehend what my worldview is and how I see the structure of the world and how I see it going in the future, and how this has been achieved. After these two programs, over the next 2 weeks, I want to discuss I'll be covering Iran next week, and the proposed military build-up against Iran and the possibility of an Israeli preemptive strike. And I'm actually going to be doing a program which sort of looks at the history of Iran, particularly the post-Second World War history, and looks at how the Anglo-American establishment has persistently meddled in the internal affairs of Iran, and how this has had a very negative outcome for the people, and how it's deeply hypocritical of America and the American political figures we see on the world stage to be taking the moral high ground about Iran, even if their nuclear program was legitimate, which Keelan did a program about this, about how farcical their actual claims are. In fact, they're not even claiming that Iran's got a nuclear weapon, or is even trying to create a nuclear weapon, because they know that those claims have no credibility. So they're just trying to create a sort of fog surrounding the issue and hoping that people will just accept it. So Keelan did a very good program on that, so that's well worth looking up if you get the chance. But I probably won't be discussing that too much, because I'm mainly going to be concentrating on the historical context of Iran and why a war shouldn't take place and why it's unjustified, and how it's actually the actions of Britain and America that has fundamentally led to the current situation, and has fundamentally it's not just steered the history of the nation. It's simply been the primary factor in the way that it's developed. So I'll be doing that next week. But as a precursor to that, today I want to discuss Syria. This is strongly related to Iran, because Syria is Iran's only major ally, really, certainly in the Middle East. And we've seen a lot of standoffs in the United Nations, the typical old-fashioned Anglo-American EU-NATO power structure has been trying to pass a resolution in the United Nations, and this has been blocked to a certain extent by Russia and China. And there's been much sabre rattling on both sides. And as I was saying last week, it's easy to get the impression from this that that because they blocked the resolution, because Russia and China don't want intervention in Syria, don't want direct intervention, don't want direct Western intervention, that they're somehow the good guys. That's not really the case. It would be wrong to come to that conclusion, but it's legitimate to look at why there is this build-up of pressure against Syria, firstly, and secondly, it's also legitimate to look at the context of this war, because Syria is, at this point in time, they're still pretending they don't want to have a ground war in Syria, which is crap, because they obviously will want to have one. Ideally, they obviously want to get Assad out of the door and take over the country and have a Anglo-American friendly regime in place without going to war. But to suggest that we might not go to war because it might be bad for the people, which is pretty much exactly the same pretense they put forward about Iraq, sort of dilly-dallying around pretending that they didn't want to invade Iraq, when in fact airstrikes have been taking place in Iraq going back to 1998. You can actually read about this. This was covered in the Times. It's covered in a book as well that I'm going to be reading from in a bit, which is called Web of Deceit by a guy called Mark Curtis. He extensively covers the airstrikes that have been taking place in Iraq that considerably predate the Iraq war that was put up on the public stage and the public were informed of. In fact, these ground sorties intensified, these air sorties I should say, intensified greatly in the year before the war actually started. So that's an interesting facet of what happened in Iraq. But when the decision was being made and when the public were being prepared to accept the fact that Iraq war would take place, which to the public's credit, I think they generally didn't accept and were generally against it. There was all the rhetoric of, we haven't decided if we're going to invade or not yet, when they'd already been bombing the place for 4 to 5 years. But this is what's happening in Syria now. Seeing the British government and the American government saying, well, we definitely don't want a ground war there because it'd be bad for the people and people would get killed. Yeah, like you care about that. So I want to compare Syria and show how it's similar and being presented in a similar way to two previous conflicts which NATO were involved in, and both of which involved both the British and American military, and continue to do so to a certain extent. that's Kosovo and Libya. Of course, the Libyan war was fairly recent and is remembered by most people, whereas Kosovo has been almost completely forgotten now because there were simply more high-profile conflicts that immediately followed it. For example, the Iraq war is probably the most remembered, although Afghanistan sandwiched between the two. So generally, the general public, I think, don't remember Kosovo, and they have a very limited knowledge and very limited recollection of what actually occurred there. And I think it's generally, to this day, believes that it was a good thing, and that it was done to dethrone a dictator that was engaged in ethnic cleansing, and it was done for the best reasons possible, and it was successful, essentially. It was presented as an ethical war, and in fact when Tony Blair came to power he talked about the fact that he wanted Britain to have an ethical foreign policy from now on. Another significant aspect to both Kosovo and Libya and a potential Syrian conflict is they were both openly supported, and I would say it's reasonable to describe it as enthusiastically supported by both The Guardian and The Independent at the time, i.e. the part of the British mainstream media that would be the most likely to oppose it. Now, I find it particularly farcical that The Guardian supported the Libya war, because The Guardian also printed an article which outlined the extent of arms sales from European nations to the Gaddafi regime. And, I'll give them credit for that, but it's just a total failure to engage in any form of joined-up thinking from these people. They print an article like that showing that all of the European nations, Germany and Britain in particular, were selling massive amounts of arms to Gaddafi right up to the point in which they decided, oh no, there needs to actually be a ground invasion in Libya. But then when the war actually begins to take place, they support it. It just doesn't make any sense. They did something similar with relation to the census, where you may or may not know, I assume quite a few people listening to this will know, that the census was run by the US military industrial contractor and arms manufacturer Lockheed Martin, and many people were opposed to this. And The Guardian printed some good articles about this, and I remember one in particular in which they printed a quotation or interviewed a US law professor who had a very strange name. I think his first name was Duvet, if I remember rightly. She was pronounced Duvet, Daouwe. I think he's from Boston. And this guy was saying, under the terms of the Patriot Act, the American government can demand all this information anytime they want. But and the claims that the British government were making about the anonymity of people who were filling in the census were completely false, and so on and so forth. And they printed some other articles saying, Lockheed Martin shouldn't be involved in this. And then after a few days, they printed an editorial saying, oh, you should fill in the census anyway, though, because it's used to plan government services. I mean, it's an absolutely bloody useless piece of information in terms of planning government services, because it's out of date. It's out of date almost immediately, and yet they only do one every 10 years. So if you think about the census 8-9 years down the line, how many people are even living at the same address that they filled in? Not very many. So, whatever the real reasons are for the census, I think it's just a combination of a box ticking exercise and just trying to get as much information about the population as possible, even useless information. And while they're at it, they can, engage in this sort of cronyism that becomes completely usual for them, which is almost like a natural reaction for them. It's almost like when a doctor taps a patient on the knee and they jerk their leg. That's what it's like when they hand these contracts out. That's just a normal reaction. It's just what they do all the time, every day. It's like the £650 million e-Borders contract that was given to Raytheon. They're another military industrial arms manufacturer, and there are any number of others. There was a passport related contract given to a French arms manufacturer called Thales, and there's no end of contracts given to people like Serco, one of the world's most contemptible companies. And everyone's heard about A4E and Atos and all the contracts they get. I'll be talking about Workfare and the work programme and all the related paraphernalia to that in a few weeks' time. But to get back to the topic I actually want to discuss today, I want to begin by discussing the Kosovo War. Now, I mentioned the book by Mark Curtis, which is called Web of Deceit, which is a very good book, even though I don't agree with all of the content, and I don't necessarily agree with his conclusions. But I think the actual content and the actual discussion of British foreign policy in it is excellent. So I just wanted to read a section which discusses the Kosovo War. and places the conflict in a little bit of context. It begins with a quotation from Tony Blair that was made on the 12th of April 1999, which he made in relation to Kosovo, and he simply says, "We will carry on pounding them day after day after day until our objectives are secured." Now, what their objectives were may be a bit different from how they're presented to the public. Let's just say that. But I'll just read briefly from this section, and then I'll discuss why the Kosovo War was absolutely nothing like how it was presented to the public, and how the results of it and how the outcomes of it were far from a great triumph for humanitarianism. The December 1998 US and British attacks on Iraq were followed by weeks of bombing and a secret escalation of the war in the no-fly zones of northern and southern Iraq. Then Britain took to war again. In March 1999, NATO forces, primarily British and American, began pounding Yugoslavia and Kosovo from the air. The bombing lasted 11 weeks until June, causing massive damage, not only to Yugoslav military forces but also the country's civilian infrastructure. The official reason for the war against Yugoslavia was to curb Milosevic's ability to wage war on an innocent civilian population in Kosovo, and to prevent an impending humanitarian disaster. The war against Milosevic's Yugoslavia has been the subject of huge debate in the political mainstream, due to the government's framing of the war as a new kind of military action taken to defend humanitarian values. The liberal press, notably The Guardian and The Independent, backed the war to the hilt and lent critical weight to the government's arguments. The Kosovo War, to me, revealed the extraordinary nature of British mainstream political culture and how willingly deceived it generally is by government rhetoric on its moral motives. In my view, the claim that the war was fought in defence of human rights is so absurd as to defy belief. This was already clear at the time, but it is even clearer now. This important episode needs to be reviewed, not only because it further highlights British contempt for international law and ethical standards, but also because one aspect of the Kosovo War was indeed new. Western leaders discovered anew that humanitarianism could be a successful pretext for military intervention, and that the mainstream political culture would buy it. So that's a pretty good summary of exactly why this is relevant to the current situation with Syria, because of course this is exactly how Syria is being presented, it's exactly how Libya is being presented. And think of the lack of public reaction against Libya compared to the public reaction against Iraq. Obviously the public reaction against Iraq was massive, whereas the public reaction against Libya was I would say there was some, but it was pretty limited by comparison, and that's because they used this humanitarian tactic. They tried to mix that in Iraq and talk about Saddam's human rights record and so on and so forth, but that wasn't really considered satisfactory justification for a war that they knew was going to last for quite a long time, and there was going to take a lot of military build-up and a lot of military presence for quite a significant amount of time. And of course there's still a military presence to this day, and there'll be private security presence from the likes of Blackwater for God knows how long, probably decades into the future. So I just want to begin by discuss the fact that, in fact, although the British government presented the idea to the public that this war was being waged in Kosovo for humanitarian reasons, and that the action they were taking were going to help the Kosovan people, in actual fact, they knew for a fact that neither of these things were true. And this has been proven by their own declassified parliamentary documents, so it's really part of the historical and parliamentary record, and it's not something that can be reasonably denied. So, the reason that the Kosovo War was mooted to have taken place at the time was, well, it was two-pronged. It was firstly a response to the what was described as an ethnic cleansing policy of the then President Slobodan Milosevic, and concurrently with that it was to remove Milosevic from power. It was the usual, Milosevic is a nasty dictator, we've got to do this for moral reasons argument that we've heard hundreds of times before. The first point to know about Kosovo is that the claim that the war prevented ethnic cleansing is completely dependent upon the bombing of Kosovo having firstly demonstrably prevented human casualties, and secondly being shown to clearly follow this policy and not predate it. Prior to the war, before it began, the Foreign Office Minister Jeff Hoon claimed that 10,000 Kosovars had been murdered by Milosevic. However, declassified documents that have since come to light and that are since part of are in the public domain, they paint a very different picture of what was occurring. One report from February 1999 noted that, quote, "the often feared humanitarian tragedy threatening the Albanian civil public has been averted," which is completely different to what was told to the public and what was indeed told to Parliament at the time. In fact, most killings that took place before the bombings were the result of fighting between Yugoslav forces and the Kosovo Liberation Army, not any policy of ethnic cleansing. A UN Special Envoy by the name of Jiri Dienstbier, I'll just spell that, it's Dienstbier. He said, "Before the bombing, Albanians were not driven away on the basis of ethnicity principle. They were victims of the brutal war between the Yugoslav army and the Kosovo Liberation Army." And Norman Brown, who was a US director of the Observer Mission in Kosovo, he stated that there was no humanitarian crisis in Kosovo until NATO began to bomb. Everyone knew that a humanitarian crisis would arise if NATO started to bomb. In fact, the mass exodus that we saw on television at the time only began once the bombing had started. The bombing, in fact, precipitated it, which is in itself not particularly surprising. Obviously, once there's a massive NATO bombing campaign, if there were any such thing as an exodus of people from a certain area, such a campaign and such an action is obviously going to accelerate that process. It's obviously going to be a catalyst for it. And this was in fact reported by the mainstream press at the time. On the 6th of May 1999, the Times reported that a NATO bomb had been the cause of one specific incident of an enormous migration of people out of the country. I'll just quote from the Times article. "In the last week, as NATO intensified its airstrikes in the area, as many as 30,000 of Prizren's Albanians, United Nations officials said, were pushed and panicked into mass flight in the few days following a bomb blast in a poor residential area. At least 5 civilians were killed and 23 wounded," Serbian news media reported. Soon after the NATO bombing began, Milosevic enacted a policy that resulted in 850,000 Kosovo refugees crossing the border into Albania and Macedonia. This was over 300% more than the 270,000 displaced people and refugees that were estimated to be present in Kosovo before the bombings began. The second point to note about Kosovo is that Parliament was completely aware of what was going on. It's not as if it's something that came to light later on. They fully knew what the situation was in Kosovo. It was reported by the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee in its inquiry that it conducted into the Kosovo War that the NATO bombing exacerbated the situation. And I'll just quote from this. "It is likely that the NATO bombing did cause a change in the character of the assault upon the Kosovo Albanians. What had been an anti-insurgency campaign, albeit a brutal and counterproductive one, involving atrocities such as that at Rakac in January 1999, became a mass organised campaign to kill Kosovo Albanians or drive them from the country. This was partly because of the Serbs' reaction to the bombing and partly because the launch of the campaign required that the OSCE monitors be withdrawn, thereby removing one of the obstacles to action against the Kosovo Albanians." And Parliament had also been warned beforehand that the bombings would almost certainly exacerbate the situation. Jane Sharp told the British Parliament that a Serbian general had warned her in October 1998 that if there were bombings, there would certainly be retaliation against the Kosovars. The third point to note about this war is that top military personnel warned Parliament that the outcome of the military action would go exactly as it did, yet they were completely ignored. People involved in the planning and implementation of the attack had warned of the likelihood that the campaign would make the situation in Kosovo worse. For example, on the 28th of March 1999, the Sunday Times had quoted General Hugh Shelton, who was chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. He'd warned on the 15th of March, 10 days before airstrikes were launched, that, quote, "there was a danger that far from helping to contain the savagery of the Serbs in Kosovo, a moral imperative cited by the President, airstrikes would simply provoke Serb soldiers into greater acts of butchery." The British Defence Committee concluded in its report of October 2000 that the MOD's professed faith in the great utility of dumb bombings suggests that it has been economical with the truth, if not deliberately attempting to mislead us, and that it was unwise for politicians within the alliance to either have thought or ever suggested that a humanitarian disaster on the ground, which by 24th of March 1999 was already underway, could be averted from the air, On the contrary, all the evidence suggests that plans to initiate the air campaign hastened the onset of the disaster. In April 1999, The Guardian reported that it had warned the British government that bombing would accelerate ethnic cleansing. As the bombing campaign began, the US NATO Commanding General Wesley Clark informed the press that it was, quote, entirely predictable that Serb terror would intensify as a result. Shortly after, Clark explained again that the military authorities fully anticipated the vicious approach that Milosevic would adopt, as well as the terrible efficiency with which he would carry it out. Of course, it was well known beforehand that such a policy could not conceivably have any positive effect, with General Wesley Clark, NATO's Supreme Commander in Europe, stating that, quote, you cannot stop paramilitary murder on the ground with aeroplanes, and that NATO's military aims were not an end in themselves, but designed to serve a political purpose. Now, that's a very brief assessment of the Kosovo War, and just gives some of the evidence that the intentions and aims of the conflict were in no way consistent with the public stated aims and the public perception that still exists to this day. There is a stack load more of evidence that's been presented in various sources, one of which being the book that I just mentioned previously, written by Mark Curtis, which the section on Kosovo lasts for about 20 pages. It's 20 pages of evidence showing that in parliamentary reports, in statements that were given to Parliament, in the military evidence that was presented, and in the intelligence that came from people like the United Nations and so forth, it was well known that this policy would have a completely disastrous effect. Now, this issue and this war has now almost been completely forgotten. Unfortunately for the people of Serbia and Kosovo and the surrounding area, there's been bitter civil war and pretty much a non-stop NATO occupation ever since this took place. It's generally presented to the public as if, there was a horrible ethnic cleansing taking place, NATO dropped some bombs, and after that everyone danced around a maypole and lived happily ever after. We didn't quite work out like that. And RT was only reporting on the situation in Serbia and Kosovo just 5 months ago. So I'd just like to play a short segment from that particular report so that you can see what the current situation is.
Well, at least 6 people have been wounded in northern Kosovo in clashes between Serb protesters and peacekeepers. NATO-run troops fired tear gas and rubber bullets while attempting to dismantle roadblocks put up by the local Serbs. Let's discuss the developments with political analyst Alexander Rhavic, now joining us live from Belgrade. Good to see you today. The barricades, as we all know, were set up last year after Kosovan and EU authorities tried to enforce a trade embargo. Is anything being done to resolve this ongoing dispute?
Unfortunately, what is being done is just more of the same from last year. The NATO forces, which are being called peacekeepers, are actually trying to use force to force the Kosovo Serbs to accept living in a independent Kosovo, which they won't accept. And that's the whole root of the problem. Negotiations really are only directed toward that end as far as the Western powers, the EU, the US are concerned. So this is just more of the same.
So you can get a general idea that things are far from perfect in this region of the world. Now you can go and look at the whole report of that on YouTube, and you can read up more background on what's going on. This was just a very brief discussion, but I've got an article here from Reuters just to act as a full stop for this particular subject. NATO plans to refocus its security operation in Kosovo on a mostly Serb northern border region after major contributor Germany said the EU's police force was, quote, on the wrong track and placing too great a burden on NATO forces there, officials said on Wednesday. Bear in mind this is 14 years after the bombing campaign took place. This NATO troops are still there in a quote-unquote security remit. This is very reminiscent of things like Iraq, which I was discussing earlier, where, although the military campaign is ostensibly ended and supposedly combat troops have been removed now, I think, although there's still a NATO military presence, but they're in a security with a security remit, and you have these private military industrial contractors the most notorious of which, as I said, was Blackwater, who retain a presence in these type of places. And this is what happens, and this is why the conflicts take place, because it benefits these military industrial and I would always say banks are always tied to the operation, because they're invested in all these companies. They bankroll all these companies as well, and they lend money to all these companies, and so on and so forth. And I will at some stage do a programme showing the extent to which the tie between these banking, military and corporations exist. But 14 years after the bombing took place, as I say, there are still NATO troops in Kosovo, and the place is a total mess. And the thing is, people will tend to throw this back at you by saying, "Oh, so are you saying you're in favour of Milosevic?" Well, no, I'm not saying I was in favour of Milosevic. I'm not really in favour of any government. I'm almost without exception against government. You get there are one or two examples of benign and ambivalent regimes in the world. They usually get bombed out of existence or overthrown or undermined by covert military intelligence action. And this has happened time and time again. And again, this is something that I'll do a programme about in the future. But yeah, generally I'm against government. I'm sure Milosevic was a bad person. I'm sure he was a terrible leader, and I'm sure he did very bad things. I mean, there's obviously strong documentary evidence to support that. I wouldn't for one moment suggest that that's not the case. Just like I wouldn't suggest that Saddam Hussein was a great person. Obviously he wasn't. But this isn't really the issue. The issue is, was the bombing campaign justified? Was the real reason ever told to the public, and did it achieve what it was supposed to achieve, or was there in fact an ulterior motive, and was the ulterior motive in fact satisfied? And I would say there was a clear ulterior motive. The public wasn't told the real reason, and look what's happened. You've got NATO troops on the ground, and it is quoted here, EULEX, which is the European Union Police Force, are also patrolling the place along with the 6,000 NATO strong force in order to deal with what is described here as occasional ethnic violence. But we know the original NATO campaign greatly escalated the ethnic violence. So it's just really about getting NATO troops on the ground there. It's another example of really acclimatising and acclimating people to the idea that NATO has this peacekeeping role all over the world. And if you actually look at the areas where NATO are involved, they're not. You wouldn't really realistically describe those areas as peaceful once NATO become involved there. So that's the first of the three conflicts I wanted to discuss. I think I'll have a breakdown then. In the second part of the programme, I'm going to discuss Libya firstly, and then lastly Syria, which is of particular importance because, as I said, it's bringing the Anglo-American establishment and the BRIC nations, particularly Russia and China, into a position of conflict, or at the very least disagreement and strong diplomatic clashes, really, you could describe them as. So I'll just play a record at this point, and I will be back in a few minutes. Now, you may recall that in the early months of 2011, there was widespread protest in the Middle East and in areas of Africa at the appalling living conditions that the average man and woman have to contend with in countries such as Egypt, Syria, Leone, Bahrain and Algeria. This is now frequently referred to as the Arab Spring. With regards to Libya, on the 14th of March of last year, David Cameron stood up before Parliament and made the following statement of intent. And I'll just quote from that particular statement. "Let me turn to the substance of Friday's special European Council. The reason for having this council was twofold. Firstly, to make sure Europe seizes this moment of opportunity to support the Arab people in North Africa and across the Middle East in realising their aspirations for a more open and democratic form of government. And second, to address the difficult situation in Libya. Mr. Speaker, I am clear where British national interest lies. It is in our interest to see the growth of open societies and the building blocks of democracy in North Africa and the Middle East. And when it comes to Libya, we should be clear about what is happening. We have seen the uprising of a people against a brutal dictator, and it will send a dreadful signal if their legitimate aspirations are crushed. not least to others striving for democracy across the region. To those who say it's nothing to do with us, I would simply respond, do we want a situation where a failed pariah state festers on Europe's southern border, potentially threatening our security, pushing people across the Mediterranean, and creating a more dangerous and uncertain world for Britain and for all of our allies, as well as for the people of Libya? My answer is clear. This is not in Britain's interests, and that is why Britain will remain at the forefront of Europe in leading the response to this crisis. Just days later, on the 18th of March 2000 of last year, Obama made a very similar statement to the American people. He said the following: "For decades, Gaddafi has demonstrated a willingness to use brute force through his sponsorship of terrorism against the American people, as well as others, and through the killings that he has carried out within his own borders. And just yesterday, speaking of the city of Benghazi, a city of roughly 700,000 people, he threatened, and I quote, 'We will have no mercy and no pity, no mercy on his own citizens.' Now here is why this matters to us. Left unchecked, we have every reason to believe that Gaddafi would commit atrocities against his people. Many thousands could die. A humanitarian crisis would ensue. The entire region could be destabilised, endangering many of our allies and partners. The calls of the Libyan people for help would go unanswered. The democratic values that we stand for would be overrun. Moreover, the words of the international community would be rendered hollow. The United States did not seek this outcome. Our decisions have been driven by Gaddafi's refusal to respect the rights of his people and the potential for mass murder of innocent civilians. The United States of America will not stand idly by in the face of actions that undermine global peace and security." So, Obama also talked about Libya in the speech at Westminster that I played a segment from last week, and how there was a moral imperative for the Anglo-American NATO establishment to intervene, and essentially proclaimed this operation to be a great success. And the language that's being used here by both Obama and Cameron is the typical sort of language that's used to justify American and British-led military action, whether it involves NATO or not. And it has been done so historically for decades, despite the fact that it has no relation to reality. But I'll be discussing the post-Second World War foreign policy of both countries probably in a couple of weeks, which is going to really be a trilogy of programmes. There's the one today, and then next week about Iran, and then finally about foreign policy, before I'll move on to talk about some other subjects. So, on the 17th of March last year, actually before Obama made this speech, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973 was passed, which enabled, just 2 days later, one day after Obama spoke, a multi-state coalition to begin military intervention in Libya. There's no public consultation required. All that's required is a supposed cause and a UN resolution. And this intervention began despite the fact that early polls regarding this issue showed that there was at best lukewarm support for it, with polls indicating that somewhere between 35 to 45% of people supported the invasion. Obviously that would have meant the majority of people were against it, somewhere in the region of 2/3 of people that were polled. Although the military intervention in Libya has been, I would say wrongly, described as being led by the French, on the 28th of March 2011, Obama affirmed his commitment to the United States military support for this war, and began this speech by stating that the United States had led the action. Just 3 months later, by June 2011, it was reported that of the American public polled by the American news agency CBS, this is a public that's supposedly hawkish and blindly supportive of their president, whatever happens. Only 30% of people felt that the United States was, quote, doing the right thing in Libya. So over 2/3 of people now are completely against this action. Obviously their feelings, opinions, thoughts weren't really taken into consideration, as is always the case in a representative democracy, where the people are never represented, or very rarely. Now, just one month before this took place, Cameron had travelled with representatives from multiple arms contractors to the Middle East. He did the same thing again this year, quite recently, and he was questioned about Saudi Arabia and its human rights atrocities, and he came up with some spurious justification for why he was in the Middle East. The Guardian reported on, this was the 21st of February last year, that Cameron had representatives of 8 arms manufacturers in tow, the most prominent being Ian King, who was chief executive of the world's biggest arms manufacturer, BAE Systems. Cameron was criticised by numerous MPs for this action, but the then, and I think still the Shadow Defence Secretary today, Kevin Jones, he gave indication of how likely the policy would be to change were Labour to become the government, because he said the following: "The defence industry is crucially important to Britain, but many people would be surprised that the Prime Minister in this week of all weeks may be considering bolstering arms sales to the Middle East." So, you know, he tried to score some political points, but ultimately he said the thing that they always say, which is the defence industry is crucially important to Britain. If we stop selling arms, you know, well, people would lose their jobs. In fact, the defence industry makes up an incredibly minuscule proportion of the overall GDP. It just has a prominent position because of what I've described previously, which is that its only customer is government, so therefore it's forged very strong ties with government, and there's been a revolving door between arms contractors and manufacturers and government. I'll hopefully discuss that in a programme in the future. At the time, the Daily Mail, The Guardian and Channel 4 News all reported on the criticism that Cameron received for, quote, talking democracy, with the arms industry in attendance. And in the same article, the Daily Mail also reported that the military equipment that was made in Britain was being used against protesters in Libya by Gaddafi. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know. It's hard to say. But we do know for certain that European countries sold arms very heavily to Libya in the run-up to this invasion. It was widely reported in February and March of last year that the EU sold Gaddafi some £343 million of weapons just in the year 2009, with Britain chipping in over £25 million worth of sales. Furthermore, in September 2011, Human Rights Watch obtained documents which showed that the US and UK worked together with Gaddafi in a secret rendition operation. Numerous media in this country reported on a secret CIA document that showed that the British and Libyans worked together to arrange for a terrorism suspect to be removed from Hong Kong to Tripoli, along with his wife and children, despite the clear risk that they will be tortured. Later, the Daily Mail also printed 2 letters sent by then Chancellor of Exchequer Gordon Brown, which offered not even tacit, quite explicit support for Gaddafi. The letter stated firstly, and I'll quote from it, "I am pleased that we continue to make progress in many areas of mutual influence," and it then goes on to discuss various diplomatic matters such as the acceptance of Libya to the United Nations Security Council. The letter then discusses Brown's hopes that Libya would purchase an air defence system from the defence contractor MBDA and expresses the desire to establish a, quote, defence industrial partnership. The letter then goes on to say, quote, "I know that BP look forward to early cabinet approval of their agreement with Libya so that they can begin many years of mutually productive investment in the development of the Libyan economy." Now, it's hard to say how this would be beneficial to the Libyan economy, or to Libya as a country, or to the Libyan people. It would certainly benefit BP. You know, British Petroleum will do okay out of it, but in what way Libya benefits is not entirely clear. But you can see. Well, I'll just say just briefly as well that Brown ended the letter by stating he hoped to develop a close personal relationship with Gaddafi. So you can see from that letter that what is being floated here, which is that, you know, if you go along with the material rape, essentially, of your country, if you go along with letting the Western corporations carve up your nation, then, you know, we'll invite Libya into the quote-unquote international community. You know, we'll legitimise your country. We'll take you out of the axis of evil, which I'll be discussing in a bit. And you can, you know, your position as the leader of this country will be secure, and we'll tell everyone that Libya are good now. You know, BP can get stuck in there, and probably ExxonMobil and Occidental Petroleum can, who I'll be talking about in a second, they can extend their influence over the country. But, you know, this obviously didn't happen, and this is why ultimately military intervention occurred in Libya. So, with relation to that, an important element to note regarding Libya is that it's Africa's biggest oil producer. I mentioned Occidental Petroleum, and they're heavily invested in Libya, and it's been strongly suggested in some quarters that the intervention against Gaddafi, proclaimed by both Cameron and Obama as being about liberty and freedom, is simply about securing the largest oil supply in Africa, some 41.5 billion barrels, the ninth largest of any country in the world, for Western corporations. There's an article on Zero Hedge about the fact that Libya has also been shown to be in possession of 144 tons of gold reserves, which is second only to Algeria among African nations. As I say, there's an article that on Zero Hedge that strongly suggests that this is a major motivation for the war as well. Now, let's go back and look at American engagement with Libya that predated this invasion. In 1981, you have the Gulf of Sidra incident. I assume it's pronounced Sidra. In the first Gulf of Sidra incident, which was on the 19th of August 1981, two Libyan Su-22 filter attack aircraft fired upon and were subsequently shot down by two American F-14 Tomcats off the Libyan coast. Now, you can imagine how this would have been spun if it was the other way around. Imagine if there were two Libyan aircraft approaching the American coast, and they were shot down. You know, it would be clearly stated that, you know, the Libyan aircraft were dangerously approaching the American coast with the intent of attacking them. But it's always presented when it's the other way around, as if, you know, the US is taking some sort of defensive posture, even though there would have been in Libyan airspace almost certainly, for no reason whatsoever. There's no good reason for them to be there. There's no legitimate reason. It's just this concept that is consistently put forward that somehow America and NATO and Britain, when we get involved in the conflicts as well, are performing some sort of peacekeeping mission, which is so far away from the truth that it's almost, I mean, it is laughable, but it's almost, it just becomes absurd at a certain point if you actually look through the entire history and how people can actually stand up with a straight face and continue to say these things on things like the BBC News and the ITN News and the likes of Fox and CNN in the United States. You know, I have no idea, but somehow they managed to do it. In 1986, Libya was blamed for the bombing of a Berlin discotheque after telex messages had been intercepted from Libya to the Libyan East Berlin embassy. The then President Ronald Reagan retaliated to this by ordering airstrikes against the Libyan capital of Tripoli and the city of Benghazi in a mission that was named Operation El Dorado Canyon. At least 19 civilians were killed in the US airstrikes on Libya, including a child described as Gaddafi's adopted 15-month-old daughter, and more than 2,000 were injured. In spite of reports blaming Libya for the attack on the nightclub, no individual was officially accused of the bombing until the 1990 reunification of Germany and the subsequent opening up of the Stasi archives. Stasi files led German prosecutor Detlev Melis to Musbar Abdulgasem Etir, a Libyan who had worked at the Libyan embassy in East Berlin. Stasi files listed him as an agent, and Melis said he was the Libyan spy agency's main contact at the embassy. Now, I just want to emphasise the final paragraph of a BBC report on this incident. The prosecution was unable to prove that Colonel Gaddafi was behind the attack, a failure which the court blamed on the, quote, limited willingness of the German and US governments to share intelligence. Now, just to briefly discuss this, we've seen that this person is an agent, and we've now seen that the German and US governments were unwilling to share intelligence on this particular issue. Now, why was that? Could this possibly be because there's more to the story than meets the eye? We know what's happened with agents in the past. We will never truly know because, you know, the documents weren't put in front of the court. But we do know for the fact that the prosecution couldn't prove that Gaddafi had anything to do with it, even if it was, you know, some form of legitimate terrorism that could be said to be carried out by a Libyan acting alone. Even if, you know, and whether or not that was the case, it's hard to say. Because I say the court have failed, the German and US governments have failed to make the intelligence available to the court, so we don't know. But we do know that Obama blamed Gaddafi for terrorist atrocities, even though in the court case they were actually unable to prove that he was involved in it. So then in 1989, the Gulf of Sidra incident, the second Gulf of Sidra incident occurred. This was on the 4th of January 1989 when two US Navy F-14 Tomcats shot down two Libyan MiG-23 floggers that appeared to have been attempting to engage them. as had happened 8 years prior in the first Gulf of Cedar incident in 1981. So again, imagine if this happened in the US. Imagine if there were 2 Libyan fighters that were near the coast of the United States, and imagine if the US scrambled 2 aircraft to engage with them, and the Libyan fighters thought, oh, those 2 US fighters appear to be engaging with us, we'll just shoot them down. So they shot them down. It was off the coast of Hawaii or something. You know, imagine the propaganda. Imagine what we would see on the US in the US media in particular. Imagine what we'd see in the British press. Imagine what the BBC would say about it. You know, the people who died, I can just see them dragging out their families onto CNN and saying, oh, the people who died, they were really good. They really liked apple pie and baseball and garden. You know, I can't believe they've been shot down. It's terrible. Because the other way around, you know, it's just presented that, oh yeah, the US just happened to be doing an exercise off the coast of Libya, and there were a couple of Libyan aircraft, and they very unreasonably appeared to be engaging with these aircraft, so we just shot them down. You know, and this is just another example of Libyan terrorism. So you can see that the US already, and in particular, had a history of meddling in Libya, and that it was a pretty checkered history. And in November 2002, The Guardian printed evidence given by an ex-MI5 officer, David Shayler, who was later imprisoned for a breach of the Official Secrets Act, which suggested that there was an MI5 plot to murder Gaddafi in 1996, in which they paid large amounts of money to a terrorist cell in Libya in order for them to carry out the assassination. So to move on to the recent US-led NATO military invasion and intervention in Libya, I'll just play a short video which describes the first drone bombings from the United States in Libya.
The United States has launched its first Predator drone strike on Libya. The US Defense Department has not provided details of the bombing, except that it occurred early in the afternoon local time. On Thursday, Washington announced that unmanned aircraft would allow more precise attacks on forces loyal to Muammar Gaddafi. The use of armed drones has been welcomed by Libyans in the rebel-held eastern city of Benghazi. The aircraft, which can stay in the air for 24 hours, have already been used to target militants along Pakistan's border with Afghanistan.
So we know very well that drone bombing is incredibly destructive in a very scattergun way, and is the idea that's put forward in that particular video that drone bombing is being utilised because it's somehow more accurate is pretty ridiculous. But anyway, while this began to take place, we got Cameron and Obama spewing the usual, oh, it's all about our security, it's all about because we care about democracy, just the usual rhetoric. Television stations and newspapers in Britain did their part by completely accepting the pretext for the NATO invasion, whereas the likes of Press TV reported on what was actually happening. Airstrikes were killing dozens of people. Of course, it's about this time that Press TV lost its British broadcasting licence. RT is obviously yet to lose its British broadcasting licence. It'll be interesting to see if that ever happens in the future, because I think the reasons that Press TV's licence were revoked were pretty laughable, considering all the number of times that the BBC has been sued for various things, which would far outweigh the one apparent misdemeanour that Press TV was revoked for. So there's an article here from the New York Times from the 9th of August 2011, which gives a considerable indication of the attitude of the press and broadcast media to this issue. It takes a rather desultory tone when discussing the airstrikes, implying that the Libyans are lying about what's happening. The article's headlined, Libya says civilians died in strike. They did, at least in the article, report the comments of the Libyan government spokesman Musa Ibrahim, who indicated that 85 civilians comprised of 33 children, 22 women and 20 men were killed in the raid on the 9th of August alone. And he said, "This is a crime beyond imagination. Everything about this place is civilian." The US military maintained that this was a legitimate target, and the New York Times strongly implied that no one had died there and that the Libyans were lying. Of course, I'd take any statement of any government with a pinch of salt, but if you look at the tens of thousands of civilians, hundreds of thousands in fact, at least, that have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you look at Iraq Body Count website, which exhaustively documents every civilian that's been died in Iraq just based on media reports. So these are just 100% confirmed civilian casualties and not injuries, deaths. That's currently standing at 120,000. So to suggest that there are not going to be any civilian casualties when you're drone bombing built-up areas is ridiculous. This is highly destructive weaponry that's being utilised in areas where there are huge amounts of civilians and just normal residential areas. It's impossible to believe that there would not be civilian deaths. Obviously, that's happened previously in Pakistan and Somalia, which I'll be discussing in a couple of weeks. Not the military deaths should necessarily be considered collateral damage, at least in terms of when another country is being invaded. The members of the military that die in the invaded country shouldn't just be considered, oh well, that's their fault for being part of the military of Libya. But civilian deaths obviously should be taken more seriously, or slightly more seriously at least. Of course, there have always been deaths in every recent Anglo-American and/or NATO conflict. Dozens, if not hundreds, of deaths in every single one. So, for the New York Times to suggest that the Libyans are lying and that drone bombing isn't causing civilian deaths is pretty ridiculous. It is laughable, in fact. And if this recent quartet of conflicts isn't enough to indicate this, remember the incredible lies and deception that happened regarding Kosovo, which was promoted as being a triumph for human rights. But again, we know for a fact the bombing campaign couldn't possibly and didn't achieve anything positive for the Kosovo people. The reality is that it's this banking, military, industrial, interdependent, commingled structure that I've been discussing over the previous 2 weeks that is driving this intervention. And they couldn't care less about the forces that control that. They couldn't care less about the Libyan people any more than they could care about any other group of people other than their own interests. As long as Occidental Petroleum get access to the Libyan oil fields, the military gets to use up Lockheed Martin's missiles, and so it can sell the government some more. And all the cronyism and the likes of Kellogg, Brown and Root now call themselves KBR. As long as they get industrial contracts and Halliburton get industrial contracts and all of these parasites that benefit from this type of activity, I mentioned Blackwater previously, and there are many others. As long as they all benefit, as long as they all make more money, as long as they all get more control over another source of valuable natural resources, that's all they care about. So, when Obama and Cameron stand up there and say it's because of American values, it's because of democracy, it's because of this, it's because of that, it's because of security, it's because he's a dictator, it's because the Libyan people are being oppressed and so on and so forth, it's completely ludicrous. It doesn't stand up to any kind of scrutiny, even just on the basis of the individual conflict. But if you look at the US, Britain and NATO historically, it's even more ludicrous. So what's the state of Libya today? Going to play a couple of videos here just to give some indication of what the state of Libya is. Both of these were originally broadcast by RT. I've mentioned RT in the past and stated that I'm fully aware they're a propaganda station, but they do a good job of covering what's really going on with America and Britain and Europe to a lesser extent, and NATO. And when you're doing an anti-Anglo-American propaganda station, the great thing about it is all you have to do is tell the truth. You don't have to make anything up. You don't have to fabricate anything. You don't even have to exaggerate anything. All you have to do is just report on what's actually happening, which the British mainstream media, almost without exception, fails to do. So I'll just play this video firstly.
Joining me now live is activist and journalist Sukan Chandan, who's been following developments in Libya. Sukan, there are reports that chemical weapons have been used in that attack on Bani Walid. Does that sound feasible?
Well, I think you and your colleagues at Russia Today, I too am getting innumerable actually reports from residents of Bani Walid that indeed the so-called non-government, they call themselves a state, but obviously it's not a state, it's 400 militias conducting mob rule across Libya, are sieging Bani Walid at the moment, including with Grad rockets and with chemical weapons. At a time when Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, the very organizations that gave the human rights cover for all the atrocities in the Libya conflict, have suddenly stated that the rebels killed around over 60 of Gaddafi's convoy a year ago, nearly to the day, and executed Gaddafi himself. Well, of course they did, because it was all over YouTube from the very first day of the Libyan rebellion, the atrocities of the rebels. Today we're seeing another siege. Before we saw the siege of Sirte, we saw the total wiping out of the 30,000 strong town of Tawarga, many of black Libyans, which the Mizrati brigades, which are also laying siege to Bani Walid, who call themselves the Brigades for the Purging of Black Skin, is such as their wonderful humanitarian and freedom-loving ideology and discourse, that they wiped out the town. They've been chasing the people of Tawarga. Even these, veritable devils in Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have stated they've been chasing the people of Tawarga all across Libya. Many Tawargans are in Bani Walid.
So I just emphasise again at this point, this is not about backing Gaddafi or lionising the Gaddafi government. It's about whether or not this was justified, whether the real reasons are ever discussed in public fora, and whether or not the Libyan people have remotely benefited from this. And I think we can reasonably conclude that A, it was not justified, B, the real reasons for the NATO intervention weren't given at the time, and C, the Libyan people have not remotely benefited from this conflict. However, if you look up that particular video on YouTube, you'll see a quote by a person called Rajveer Singh. And I can't really comment about this because there's been so much propaganda on this issue, it's very difficult to get to the bottom of what's really going on. But I've heard other people say exactly this, so I'll just quote what he's written on YouTube. There hasn't been, nor will there ever be, a man that loved his people so much like Muammar Gaddafi. Libya was a beautiful country, and the citizens of Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa. Women and men had equal rights in Libya. All education, electricity and healthcare was free. There were no beggars or homeless people in Libya. So that's just really reiterating something that I've heard said previously. I certainly think there's quite strong evidence to suggest that what he's saying about the standard of living is true. I wouldn't be such a big believer in Gaddafi necessarily being a good person. I'm sure he acts in his own interest, as virtually all political leaders do. However, I have no doubt whatsoever, and if you look at any number of videos and any number of pieces of evidence regarding Libya and the situation there today, that the situation for the people has greatly declined. So I'm going to play some segments from a second video now. This discusses the current situation in Libya, again, just to make it even clearer. And a critical part of this is where the person discusses the arming of rebels by America, United States, because this is exactly what's currently going on in Libya, which is an open policy, as I'll be discussing in due course. So I'll just play this video, which discusses the situation in Libya, firstly.
Well, in Libya, at least 11 people have been killed and scores wounded after the militia there linked to the Defence Ministry shelled Bani Walid, a former stronghold of the late Colonel Gaddafi. The country remains close to chaos following the Western-backed armed rebellion last year that toppled the nation's longtime dictator. Let's now talk to Libyan political activist Ali Al-Qassa, joining us live on RT. Good to see you today. It's almost a year since Gaddafi was killed. The situation, though, is far from stable, with deadly clashes continuing between various sectarian groups. Would you call the Arab Spring a success for Libya?
No, for Libya it's a total chaos. It's not been a spring at all. It's actually a very heavy or strong hurricane that hit Libya, and now in Libya it's more division now in Libya than has never been before.
I mean, let's talk about trying to bring some sort of stability there. The US has decided to divert roughly $7 or $8 million from activities in Pakistan to now try and put together a 500-strong commando force for Libya to try and bring peace and stability there. Well, what's your view on that?
Well, when they went to Iraq, they had at least 200,000 soldiers. They were unable to bring peace to Iraq. I don't think with 500 they will bring peace to Libya. Definitely, they don't want peace in Libya. They don't want stability in Libya. If they wanted this, they could have had a success in Iraq. Libya now is controlled by militia and gangs. The city of Bani Walid and the tribal areas in Libya, they are sick and tired of those who are controlling the city, who are killing and who are behind torture of the Libyans. This is another revolution, in my opinion, against oppression led by the militias.
All right, so you're talking about oppression, a bit of a revolution against the oppression led by the militias, as you say, but I do apologise, I'm running low on time here. In the short term, what's the future of Libya?
Chaos. I just see chaos in Libya. There will be no future, in my point of view. Fighting took place in the last year in many different places in Libya. I feel that the media is not really covering the real situation in Libya, because they don't want to set this example for Syria and say, well, we succeeded in Libya, so we will succeed in Syria. The fact, the fighting in Libya on a daily basis. Prisons are full of people in the city of Misrata, in Tripoli. You could see the reports on YouTube or on other media channels showing that they are being killed on a daily basis, Libyans. So we call this, what's taking place now is a revolt against oppression and torture in Libya, led by Warfella tribe.
All right, Libyan political activist Ali Al-Qasser, thank you very much for coming on RT today. Sorry, that's all the time we have for us.
Thank you.
So you can see that the current situation on the ground in Libya is chaotic and disastrous, which is exactly as it was intended to be, with the US and Britain having invested in Al-Qaeda linked groups to essentially carry out some of the operation in Libya, which is exactly what's been going on in Syria, as I'll be discussing in the next part of the programme. I just want to finish this particular part by just reading briefly from an article that was published in September of this year on the World Socialist website, and it's headlined, US blames Libya attack on Al-Qaeda linked forces it previously backed. And it starts, US officials investigating the September the 11th attack on the US consulate in Benghazi now suspect it may have been carried out by Al-Qaeda linked forces that Washington backed during last year's NATO war to topple Libyan leader Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. They identified Abu Sufyan Ibrahim Ahmed Ahmouda bin Kimu as a potential figure behind the attack, which killed 4 Americans, including US Ambassador to Libya J. Christopher Stevens. Bin Kimu is a leading member of the Ansar al-Sharia brigade in Benghazi, which has been blamed for the attack. He also reportedly is a member of the Al-Qaeda-linked Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and leads the Darna Brigade, an armed group in his hometown of Darna in northeastern Libya, which fought on the side of NATO in the war for regime change last year. And an important thing to remember about all this, leaving aside the moral reprehensibility of it and leaving aside the complete chaos and disaster that it's brought to Libya and all the stuff related to the funding of Al-Qaeda linked groups. I must emphasise again that Al-Qaeda is just an ideology. People tend to get this impression that there's this huge network of this huge terrorist network that crosses borders and is all linked together. It's just really a series of splinter groups that claim this ideology as being their motivation. That it's not as if they report back to some sort of central command after they've done it. They just commit terrorist atrocities due to whatever Islamic sort of phony motivation, which is obviously not in any way justified by their beliefs that they have, and then they say, oh, we're Al-Qaeda, we're part of Al-Qaeda. It's just purely an ideological thing. So I think it's important to emphasise that. But the important thing to remember is that no one asked the Libyan people whether they wanted this. No one went into the country and conducted some sort of straw poll. All that happened was we heard on our TV news, Obama and Cameron saying, "Oh, we've worked out that Gaddafi's a bad man and we need to stop him because he's bad," and whatever means we engage in to do this, it's all going to be justified because the Libyan people will benefit. Had you conducted some sort of poll in Libya saying, would you like the US and Britain and NATO to intervene militarily? Would you like NATO troops to be permanently stationed on the ground in your country? Would you like to be drone bombed by US Predator drones? And would you like the US to arm and fund Al Qaeda in order to help with the operation? I'm pretty sure they would have voted against it. But this is the scant regard that is paid for democracy by these people that constantly claim to be representing those interests. And of course, they place scant regard to democracy in their own country as well, with Cameron completely backtracking on all the promises he's made about an EU referendum. Of course, when he was in opposition, he made out that this was an issue of critical importance, and then completely backtrack on it. So these people don't care about democracy. They don't care about democracy for you. You better believe they don't care about democracy for some dusty country in Africa that they would never go to under any circumstances, and don't know any of the people, and won't meet any of the people, and aren't responsible for what happens, and are not directly answerable to any of those people. Of course they don't care about them. Of course they don't care about whether what they're doing promotes democracy or whether it can be reasonably described as democratic. You know, they're just there to represent the oil interests. They're just there to represent the corporate interests. They're just there to represent the banking interests, and that's what they do. So you end up with NATO troops on the ground, and this is why you end up with US military bases all over the world, because most of the world is in a permanent state of chaos. And it's because of US foreign policy, of which Britain has contributed and been the most vocal and consistent backer. As I've said previously, in situations where every other member of the UN has been completely against certain US actions, Britain has always backed them in every situation. And usually they've offered more than simply tacit support. They've usually offered at least some form of military support as well, or often financial support. So that's really the end of part 2 of the programme. I think I'm going to do a 3-part programme. Seems logical, seeing as in the third part I'd like to talk about Syria. So that was quite a long section, so it seems natural to have a break now. So I'll just play a song and then I'll be back in the third part to talk about Syria. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about Syria now, and I want to preface this by discussing something that occurred in February 2008. So I'm just going to read from a New York Sun article of that time. A foreign policy advisor to Senator Obama is scheduled to arrive in Syria today as the leader of a Rand Corporation delegation. Zbigniew Brzezinski will travel to Damascus for meetings as part of a trip Syria's official news agency described as an important sign that the end of official dialogue between Washington and Damascus has not prevented dialogue with important American intellectuals and politicians. An assistant to Mr. Brzezinski, Trudy Werner, told the New York Sun yesterday he is leading a delegation for RAND and they will be in Damascus. It is a high-level delegation and they are meeting with some high-level people in the region. There are no shortage of issues in the Middle East to discuss, as I'm sure you know. So, just discuss the RAND Corporation briefly. On Wikipedia for the RAND Corporation, it states here, since the 1950s, the RAND has been instrumental in defining US military strategy. The most visible contribution is the doctrine of nuclear deterrence by mutually assured destruction, developed under the guidance of then Defence Secretary Robert McNamara and based upon their work with game theory. Chief strategist Herman Kahn also posited the idea of a, quote, winnable nuclear exchange in his 1960 book on thermonuclear war. This led to Kahn being one of the models for the titular character of the film Dr. Strangelove. So, I mean, the RAND Corporation, an incredibly influential think tank. Some people believe that it's really steering all of American foreign policy. And if you have a look at the list of notable participants on Wikipedia, it's simply a who's who of the post-Second World War US foreign policy positions. There's an article here on a site called Mental Floss, and I don't actually endorse the title of this particular article because I think people, this is one example of something that people have a tendency to do, which is exaggerate and go overboard about certain things. Yeah. You see the same thing with Bilderberg, with people saying that Bilderberg controls the world. I've obviously spoken about Bilderberg in the past, and I'll probably speak about it in the future. And I believe it has a significant influence on what's going on, and I think it's used to welcome key figures into a way of thinking that dominates the political discourse and dominates the way that the world is run. But I don't think it's running the world. Similarly, this article is titled "The Rand Corporation, the think tank that controls America." Now, I don't think that's quite correct. I think that the Rand Corporation has a very significant influence over America, probably. But to say that it controls it is too strong. It's that kind of expression and that kind of assertion that makes people say, it's just a conspiracy theory. If you really said the Rand Corporation, the influential think tank that is behind the curtain and not really talked about very much, that would be a lot more reasonable. But I'll just read from this article because I do endorse some of the content. If you think the internet came out of Silicon Valley, that NASA planted the first satellite to orbit Earth, or that IBM created the modern computer, think again. Each one of these breakthroughs was conceived at RAND, a shadowy think tank in Santa Monica, California. The article goes on to discuss the history of the Rand Corporation, and it states here, by the 1960s, America's rivals were paying attention. The Soviet newspaper Pravda nicknamed RAND the Academy of Science and Death and Destruction. American outfits preferred to call them the Wizards of Armageddon. So, to talk about the relevance this has to Syria, the current propaganda and military build-up against the country was precipitated by this Brzezinski visit. It's quite evident from this visit the US didn't evidently get what they wanted, as this supposed dialogue that was opening between the two countries closed pretty quickly. So as with Gordon Brown opening dialogue with Gaddafi, I would very much assume that the same sort of proposals were put to Assad related to resources and related to them essentially supporting Anglo-American, NATO, US foreign policy and policy in general. And probably Assad wasn't receptive to that, and then they decided, okay, the time has come to ramp up the military and diplomatic pressure against him. And in October 2008, I'll read an article here from The Guardian just to show, and again, I was talking earlier about the Gulf of Sidra attack and how it would have been perceived it was the other way around. This is something that occurred in October 2008, and this is just normal conduct for the United States in their foreign policy. US forces kill 8 in helicopter raid on Syria. American helicopters flying from Iraq landed inside Syria yesterday and dropped special forces who killed 8 people, the Damascus government said last night, as Washington admitted it had targeted, quote, foreign fighters. Syria warned that it held the US, quote, wholly responsible for this act of aggression and all its repercussions. So imagine if Syria just landed a helicopter in the United States, just killed 8 people and then said, oh yeah, we're just killing foreign fighters. Again, would have been blown out of all proportion. It probably would have been used as justification for a war in itself, in all probability. But when the US do it, they're just doing it for peaceful reasons, obviously, even though it was completely unprovoked. But this is the kind of thing that you don't. I mean, that was actually reported by The Guardian. But when the case for war is put forward, you don't really hear these type of things being reported in context. So, if you fast forward to 3 years later, August 2011, this was really when the ramping up of pressure against Syria began to intensify. In a written statement on the 18th of August 2011, Obama stated the following: "The future of Syria must be determined by its people, but President Bashar al-Assad is standing in their way. His calls for dialogue and reform have rung hollow, while he is imprisoning, torturing and slaughtering his own people. We've consistently said that President Assad must lead a democratic transition or get out of the way. He has not led. For the sake of the Syrian people, the time has come for President Assad to step aside." And at the same time, Obama also announced, quote, "unprecedented sanctions to deepen the financial isolation of the Assad regime and further disrupt its ability to finance a campaign of violence against the Syrian people." So this is just the old technique that we've seen 1,000 times and seen carried out very recently. You starve the country with sanctions, you ramp up the propaganda against the Syrian government, you blame it for the conditions created by your sanctions, and in this case, the the behaviour of the quote-unquote rebels that were armed and have received they were initially received military aid, which is essentially the same thing as arming them, but now they're actually receiving weaponry from the United States and British governments as well. Then you publicly state that you're considering military action, but it hasn't been decided yet, and there could still be a diplomatic solution to what is taking place. Then you go to the United Nations, you pass a unanimous resolution, and then that leaves the NATO, usually US-led coalition, sometimes just the United States on their own, to bomb the living crap out of them, overthrow the government, and then put a sympathetic government in place, and then steal all the resources. Or if it wasn't a resource-led war, which they almost always are, then you've achieved your geostrategic imperative, as Brzezinski put it, because you've put a government in place that is receptive to what you want them to do. It's a puppet government in essence. So this is what is now occurring with Syria. Just to mention briefly, this isn't the primary motivation for the war, in my opinion, but Syria is the only major oil-producing country in the Eastern Mediterranean region. So we've seen throughout this year, particularly beginning in the early months of this year, that the pressure against the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad has been stepped up. The United Nations Security Council drafted a resolution to intervene in what it claimed to be the violent repression of the Syrian people. Other people, activists within inside Syria, have stated that the situation is very different to that. It's quite difficult to truly know exactly what is going on because there's so much propaganda, and of course it's now a completely war-torn country. So to get to the bottom of precisely what is going on, whether Assad, is this kind of vulgar dictator that he's being described as being by the Western powers, it is very difficult to tell precisely. However, with regards to the United Nations sanctions, in a theme that will become increasingly prominent and is becoming prominent now, Russia and China were at odds with the traditional Anglo-American EU-NATO power structure, and they vetoed the resolution, and they are ostensibly seeking a peaceful resolution. Whether they actually care about a peaceful resolution, or whether they simply feel that this is a propaganda war, or they have some other form of ulterior motive for opposing the Anglo-American establishment, or whether that will just become like an automatic reaction for them from now on, remains to be seen. It was reported at the time by Russian media that Russia was seeking a peaceful resolution to the conflict, whereas Western media, there were blanket reports stating that Russia had sold arms to Syria. Of course, Britain and America are selling arms to the other side, and they'd sold arms to Libya before they invaded Libya. So it's important to note these things. I don't want to imply that Russia are the good guys, Britain and America are the bad guys, and China are also the good guys, or anything like that. The situation is a lot more nuanced than that, and really none of these people are the good guys necessarily. But it's important, just for the sake of the public record, to actually record the facts of what occurred. So we had a lot of mainstream media reports at the time stating that al-Assad was slaughtering his own people. But this, regardless of whether or not this is accurate, and as I said, it's very difficult to actually ascertain whether or not it's accurate. I'll be discussing that in more depth in due course, but it overlooked two important things. Firstly, Syria was named in the infamous Axis of Evil by the United States in May 2002, but it's taken over a decade for anything to really occur. I suppose the action is now beginning with the arming of the quote-unquote rebels. And this is occurring, of course, coincidentally at a time when combat troops are being withdrawn from Iraq, so there are more military resources to devote towards it. So as much as the United States are implying that this is a humanitarian-driven action, there's been a decade when they could have engaged with Syria, and of course they haven't done so. And now, when they have the combat and military capabilities to do so, seemingly, although they're still very much committed to Afghanistan, and there are many other areas in which they're engaging, but they would appear to have more military potential to be able to do something about Syria now. So all of a sudden, they're reporting that they're human rights atrocities. At the same time, people inside Syria, activists and Syrian people are reporting that actually it's the rebels that are causing all the problems, and it's the NATO intervention that's causing all the slaughtering. And what's being described by Western media and depicted by Western media as the slaughter of people by Assad is in fact NATO causing chaos within the country. So that's the first point. If we look at the axis of evil and what's happened to the countries that are in it, you've got Iraq, that's obviously already been taken out. Libya, that, as I've discussed today, has already been taken out. You've got Iran, that's the next big target for them after Syria, and that's the reason they're going after Syria. There's Cuba, who was, I'll be discussing in a couple of weeks, they were the source of propaganda for decades, and they were targeted with the Bay of Pigs invasion and Operation Northwoods. And Castro has been a reviled figure in the United States for decades. And then there's North Korea. Obama has painted North Korea as being a threat to the United States, described it as isolated, and pledged unwavering support for South Korea. So we'll be interesting to see what happens with regards to North Korea. Again, not a particularly admirable country based on the reports that we receive about it that would appear to be fairly accurate. But is there any justification for any form of US military or military industrial intelligence agency based intervention? Probably not, I would suggest. The second reason is that, as I just mentioned, that the mainstream media ignored all the evidence that was coming to light at this time. They suggested that the full story on Syria had yet to emerge, and is still really yet to emerge, which is we never really heard the full story about Kosovo in the mainstream media. Professor Boris Dolgov, a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences and the Institute of Oriental Studies in Moscow, visited Syria, and he reported that, quote, Syria is undeniably grappling with the threat of foreign occupation. While the offensive is inordinately violent, the population will not be intimidated. Aware of the disaster wrought by NATO humanitarian operations in Yugoslavia and Libya, the Syrians refuse to be drawn into a sectarian ambush. A process of reform and development is on track, but it will not be dictated from abroad. In Syria, one may object to the president, but not to national sovereignty. And then Dolgov went on to report on terrorist bombings in Damascus and on Bashar al-Assad's speech in January 2011, during which he vowed to defeat a, quote, conspiracy against Syria. The article continues by saying, the armed opposition which conducted terrorist attacks in Syria is represented by a number of groups from a military wing of the Muslim Brotherhood to the Libyan radical Islamists and Al-Qaeda. In its turn, this issue is directly linked to the development of the global policies and will depend on the activities of the leading countries of NATO, Turkey, the Arab League, Russia and China. So I'll return to the statement that was made about Al-Qaeda there in due course, but as you can see, this is a very similar situation to what is occurring in Libya that I discussed in the previous part. As far back as September 2011, Professor Michel Chossudovsky had reported that NATO was supporting armed insurrection within Syria. And in December 2011, it was already reported, before the unrest in Syria became a focus of the Western media, that NATO troops were massing on the Syrian border. This was widely reported in the Middle Eastern media and by the likes of RT and Press TV, but it was completely blacked out of the Western press. Literally no one reported it at all. So you see, again, there's this dichotomy between the way these two power blocks are responding to the situation there. However, as I stated previously, in the early months of this year, the British and American political establishment were not merely ramping up the pressure and rhetoric against Assad, they were also openly intervening. Britain provided £500,000 worth of military aid to the opposition to Assad, and this was confirmed at the time by Foreign Secretary William Hague. And while this was going on, the US were traversing the well-worn paths that they've done in the past, with regards to Iraq in particular, claiming that Syria was in possession of chemical weapons. This is pretty hypocritical of the United States because Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against the Kurdish people that were built in a plant erected by the US corporation Bechtel. This was while the US government openly supported Saddam, and they were well aware that it was going on. They then changed their minds and invaded Iraq, then pulled out, and then invaded again. But I'll be discussing that again, possibly in a couple of weeks. So the Anglo-American establishment is openly supporting the quote-unquote Syrian rebels. How should we define this group? On the 26th of February 2012, Hillary Clinton confirmed that the United States was siding with Al-Qaeda in Syria. She told the BBC, quote, We have a very dangerous set of actors in the region, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and those who are on our terrorist list, to be sure supporting," and then she stopped and said, "claiming to support the opposition in Syria." Of course, she's well aware they are supporting the opposition in Syria, but she realised that she nearly dropped a clowner by saying it, so she backed away from that. But they're well aware of what's going on. To suggest they don't know whether or not these Al-Qaeda affiliated groups that are supporting the opposition in Syria is ridiculous. They obviously do know. They're arming them, after all. The aforementioned Professor Chozadovsky wrote in response to this, quote, "It is richly ironic that the unelected fundamentalist Sunni regimes of the Persian Gulf are supporting Al-Qaeda affiliated groups within Syria, purportedly to bring about democratic reforms." So this was reported on the BBC. This is reported in an article by the BBC entitled "Clinton, Syria Risking Civil War," if you wish to look that up. And it's been extensively reported since that Al-Qaeda has been involved, or Al-Qaeda affiliated groups have been involved in Syria and are making up a significant proportion of the quote-unquote rebel response to Assad. There's an article by the Syrian Free... There are any number of articles, so I'm not going to read from all of them or even read from any of them. I'm just going to read the headlines just so that this can be confirmed. We've got the Syrian Free Press, Al-Qaeda terrorists attacking Syrian security forces and torture. ABC News also reporting on this issue. Got RT here, arming Al-Qaeda, US to pump weapons into Syria war zone. US backs Al-Qaeda to mutually destroy Syria. Press TV, US arms Al-Qaeda terrorist in Syria. And remember, this was about the time that Press TV's British broadcasting licence was dissolved. And this was, as I said earlier, for something that was incredibly petty compared to some of the things that the BBC have been involved in. Again, this was completely blacked out of the Western media. So let me remind you what Mark Curtis said about the Kosovan conflict. I'll just read from that book again, just so that we're clear on what the mainstream press said with regards to that and how inadequate their response was to that particular conflict, just so that we can keep in mind what the response to the Syrian conflict has been. The liberal press, notably The Guardian and The Independent, backed the war to the hilt and lent critical weight to the government's arguments. The Kosovo War to me revealed the extraordinary nature of British mainstream political culture and how willingly deceived it generally is by government rhetoric on its moral motives. In my view, the claim that the war was fought in defence of human rights is so absurd as to defy belief. This was already clear at the time, but it is even clearer now. This important episode needs to be reviewed not only because it further highlights British contempt for international law and ethical standards, but also because one aspect of the Kosovo War was indeed new. Western leaders discovered anew that, quote, humanitarianism could be a successful pretext for military intervention and that the mainstream political culture would buy it. So this pattern, which recurred with regards to the Kosovo War 13 years ago, is now being completely repeated with regards to Syria. Now, Hillary Clinton, who I just mentioned with regards to stating that Al-Qaeda are supporting or possibly even driving the rebel reaction to Assad in Syria, had already made the following statement. I think this was in 2011. So I'll just play a brief video to you now of Clinton making this particular statement.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia. And we went to work. And it was President Reagan, in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these mujahideen. And let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union. And guess what? They retreated. They lost billions of dollars, and it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's a very strong argument, which is, wasn't a bad investment to end the Soviet Union, but let's be careful what we sow because we will harvest. So we then left Pakistan. We said, okay, fine, you deal with the stingers that we've left all over your country. You deal with the mines that are along the border. And by the way, we don't want to have anything to do with you. In fact, we're sanctioning you. So we stopped dealing with the Pakistani military and with ISI, and we now are making up for a lot of lost time.
So let's just contemplate what's occurring here. NATO has been massing troops on the border of Syria for months, and now the US and UK are openly supporting the rebels, giving them military aid, which has been stepped up a great deal since it was first announced, of course. And recently it's been stated that actual physical arms will be provided to the rebels as well. And we know that the so-called rebels include groups that are sympathetic to the Al-Qaeda ideology, because this has been extensively confirmed by eyewitnesses and even by the United States Secretary of State, who has also conceded that the United States funded these groups into existence. And of course, Al-Qaeda is supposed to be the United States public enemy number one and the sole focus of its foreign policy and war on terror. Yet the British and US are arming, funding and supporting them as we speak to achieve their foreign policy aims. Aims which I might add have never gone before a parliament or been put before any sort of vote. I mean, realistically, this is completely illegal activity, as well as being completely immoral and utterly hypocritical. So what's going on in Syria as we speak? Really, this programme, this subject deserves a programme all of its own. But I'll just briefly read from one article that was written for the Centre for Research on Globalisation. This article is entitled "Syria, Washington's Death Squads Caught in the Act." Washington wages direct and proxy wars dirty. Favoured allies are cold-blooded killers. Cutthroats are America's favourites. The more vicious, the better. America's so-called responsibility to protect is a licence to brutalise and kill. Guns for hire willing to commit unspeakable crimes for a buck are recruited, armed, funded, trained and deployed to commit the most heinous ones imaginable. Nothing too gruesome is out of bounds. Killing goes on daily like sport. Massacres are strategically timed. Last June, death squads murdered over 100 Hula civilians. They were executed in cold blood. Children were slaughtered like adults. Pro-government loyalists were targeted. Assad was wrongfully blamed for terrorist killings and atrocities. It wasn't the first time or last. Weeks later, death squads murdered dozens of Trems-aged civilians. Assad was again blamed. Western and UN Human Rights Council reports were fabricated. The mainstream media reported them like gospel. Facts don't interfere with propaganda, it's standard policy. Last March, a rare exception reported accurately. Der Spiegel, which is a German newspaper, discussed the Homs Burial Brigade. An insurgent executioner, said he and comrades, quote, kill in the name of the Syrian revolution. They leave torture to the so-called interrogation brigade. They do the ugly work. He believes in violence, he explained. He, quote, cut the throats of 4 men. He machine-gunned many more. Executions happen regularly, he said. Assad loyalists are targeted, brutalised and murdered. Women and children aren't spared. Der Spiegel's execution article explained all of this. The publication said a little more by way of follow-up. Last March, Human Rights Watch also reported on Syrian, quote, armed opposition groups committing abuses. An open letter to the leaders of the Syrian opposition accused them of targeted killings, summary executions, kidnappings for ransom, torture, hostage-taking and other violent crimes. And there are stacks more articles documenting similar atrocities. And a situation that exists on the ground in Syria, which is a world away from a struggle for freedom, peace, liberty and democracy. Now, again, I'm not going to read from all of these articles because there are dozens, but I'll just read you the title of a few of them. So on the World Socialist website you have military escalation, Israel launches missile strike against Syria. Israel shells Syria and Gaza. Syria, US-backed terrorist mass murder unarmed civilians. Turkey already waging war on Syria. Washington plays hardball with Russia on Syria. Turkey leads US-sponsored military encirclement of Syria. Now, as I said previously, this has been planned for 10 years, at least, ever since Syria was added to the axis of evil in May 2002. The reason being is that Syria is Iran's last ally in the Middle East. I'm just going to quote from a BBC article very briefly from a guy called Jonathan Marcus, who's a BBC diplomatic correspondent, who said in this article, Syria is one of Iran's most important allies, a pro-Iranian foothold in the Arab Middle East. Now, I'm not going to quote the rest of his statement because it's absolute crap and I'd have to break it down to show to you why it's complete nonsense, but he simply confirmed that Syria is one of Iran's most important allies. So the situation we have today is that you see the BRIC nations that I was discussing last week and the Anglo-American establishment that I discussed in my first programme coming to blows over Syria and Iran. And I'm just going to read a section from my own book that just discusses this issue in more depth. While there is a temptation to see such issues in the world in general in terms of good guys and bad guys, and this is how our leaders perpetually present it to us, in accordance with the doctrines of Goebbels, quote, the most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind constantly. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over. The reality is that the Syrian and Iranian standoffs represent two power blocks acting in their own interest, not those of the Syrian people, or Russian people, or Chinese people, or British people, or American people. They will be the absolute last element of consideration, if they are considered at all. Iraq was a total disaster and continues to be. Afghanistan was a total disaster and continues to be. Libya was a needless slaughter motivated by corporate oil desires. The drone bombing of Pakistan and Somalia has been disastrous, and quite rightly strongly criticised. Cameron embarked on a tour of the Middle East in 2011 with numerous arms manufacturers in tow, with the intention of selling arms all over the region, as Britain, the US and Israel continue to do. Britain has been complicit in the slaughter of 10 million people since the end of the Second World War, and the US has intervened militarily overseas 77 times since the Second World War, and has military bases in 135 nations. Both countries are absolutely, totally, completely, utterly and irretrievably flat broke, within the region of 50 million Americans now in receipt of food stamps, an increase of 50% in just 3 years. And in Britain we are going to see similar conditions to Greece in the very near future, where the IMF are helpfully bailing the Greeks out in return for slashes in benefit, pensions and jobs. All that remains to be seen is whether the people will continue to drink the Kool-Aid over Syria, despite the fact that the Anglo-American foreign policy has a negative effect on every single one of us, rarely if ever benefits any of the people in the countries that are being invaded, and the potential consequences of an invasion of Syria and or Iran would far outweigh anything seen previously. So all this propaganda has been put out which bears no relation to what is happening, and it's an almost exact parallel to what we've seen before in Kosovo and Libya, which I discussed earlier in the programme. And the mainstream media are just sucking this up like it's lemonade. So we shouldn't do the same, because this is just a stepping stone to Iran, which could have much greater consequences. I discussed these previously. Was discussing the television programme drama film Threads, in which standoff over Iran between the Soviet Union and the United States leads to a full-scale nuclear war. I don't expect to see that happen, but the fact is that it's a consequence that cannot be ruled out completely. So that's what I'm going to be talking about next week. I'm going to be talking about the situation in Iran and the history of the country and the Anglo-American establishment's meddling with the Iranian nation. I'll just remind you that you can listen to today's programme again by visiting the Flipping the Pyramid website, which is flippingthepyramid.co.uk, or via my YouTube channel, which is Breakdown Radio Show, which is all one word. Finally, regarding the content of today's programme, if there's any particular element of it that you liked or disliked, I'll say what I always say: don't take my word for it, look it up for yourself. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you all next week.